Welcome to Christ and St. Stephen's, which offers one of those only in New York experiences, a beautiful little country village church amid the skyscrapers of Manhattan, just a short walk from Lincoln Center. Our special challenge here was to design an organ adequate for a very sophisticated Anglican music program with a professional choir in a fairly low-ceiling church seating only 150 and with a relatively dry acoustic. After a brief musical introduction, Nigel and I will take you on a musical tour through each of the organ's 15 stops and some of its other special features. Well, you couldn't have picked a better piece to start out.
Thank you.
That's an organ builder's dream, a kaleidoscope of tone. Very, very nicely done. I think you and I agree that the organ is really not a keyboard instrument, but an ensemble of wind instruments.
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't think people realize that when you're playing this three-stave score, that it's really nothing more than a composer's sketch. And you have to orchestrate.
Exactly.
Pick out the sounds you want to use, in the register you want to use them, and so on, everything that an orchestrator does. And it's quite an art, and a somewhat an unsung art, because so many people don't realize that's what you have to go through every time you prepare a piece. Well, the job of the organ builder is to try to give you the instruments you need. In other words, you're the orchestrator, I'm the orchestra contractor,
Right.
hiring the players. And I'm trying to come up with an ensemble that gives you the maximum utility from just, in this case, 17 ranks or 15 stops. And so that's what we're trying to show today. If you'll give us some musical examples, we'll try to show what goes into making an organ of this type and the kind of versatility that's needed in a very sophisticated music program here at Christ and St. Stephen's. I think the way to start is to go through each of the tones individually and then show a few of the special effects. The first one I'd like to hear, and I think others would like to hear, is a flute tone. That's the oldest of all musical instruments and maybe the most common tone on all organs. And the one that sounds most like the flute we're used to in the orchestra is the harmonic flute. Mm-hmm. And do you have something sprightly as well as lyrical to play?
That's right, yes, it's sprightly.
Well, that's sprightly enough. How about a lyrical piece? Well, very nice. Now, we also have another kind of flute that's unique to the organ. It's called a stop diapason. Now, why it's called stop diapason would take a lot of explanation we don't have time for. It's kind of a typical old story with organs of confusing nomenclature. But the stop diapason is a wooden flute with the top stoppered, so the pipe is half its normal length and therefore twice its normal scale. It gives a very, very beautiful, rich flute tone. Let's hear the stopped diapason. Now let's do some orchestration and add a 2-foot stop to it. This is the 2-foot 15th, which adds a very, very sprightly and bright sound to the flute. Now there's a third kind of flute in this organ called a chimney flute. The chimney flute is also stopped, but it has little tiny tubes at the top of the pipe that are called chimneys. It is a very small-scaled flute made of metal, but has a very, very characteristic tone, which includes some tierce component, that is the sound of the third of the musical scale, along with its unison. It's a very, very piquant sound. Could you show us that? Gives a nice effect, even though both pipes are stopped. They're different enough that they have an attractive effect. Well, Nigel, this organ has a quaint little stop called tierce, which is tuned a third above unison pitch. Well, that's a very delicate little sweet sound, but I think it carries quite a punch when it's used together with other stops. Why don't you demonstrate that?
Right, so this was 8-foot stop diapason, adding the chimney flute, 2 2/3, 2-foot, and the tierce.
That's quite a strong effect, all made by flue pipes. It almost has a reedy sound, doesn't it?
Does indeed.
There's so many other things that could be done with these stops called mutations that are tuned a third or in some cases a fifth off unison. And one very nice effect on this organ is the stop diapason with the Nazard. But before you play it, I should explain that the Nazard is a borrowed stop. That is, it is taken from the chimney flute. So this is a case of doubling. If I were hiring an orchestra, I'd want the oboist to bring an English horn. Well, I asked the stop diapason to bring along a Nazard. So why don't you show the 8-foot stop diapason with Nazard as a solo stop? Now there's another traditional organ effect besides the cornet, which is very commonly used, called a sesquialtera. That's the 8-foot stop diapason with the Nazard and the tierce, nothing in between. It's quite an interesting sound. Now you've heard tremulant sound through this demonstration a few times. The tremulant upsets the wind supply in a very delicate and gentle way to make a vibrato, as a singer would call it, or we call it in the organ world a tremolo or tremulant. Now maybe you could play that last passage with tremulant to show the difference. Nigel, we've had a good time introducing flutes. The next big family of tone is strings, but before we get into the strings, I'd like to look at the sort of halfway in between stop that we tend to call hybrid stops. That is, pipes that are very tapered in shape, in other words, much smaller at the top than they are at the mouth, that make kind of a mysterious horn-like tone that's very, very engaging and very useful in many, many roles. In this organ, it's called the corno dolce, and it works so well in soft accompaniments and atmospheric effects so necessary in the Anglican service. And also, it's just a pretty solo tone itself, too. So we have the corno dolce, and it has a celeste rank, tuned a little bit sharp to give an undulating, waving effect. And if you could play that, corno dolce, and then add the celeste, and then it has a 16-foot bass, so it would be nice to add that, too.
Right, very good.
Elgar is really the organ builder's friend. Whether it's orchestral music or organ music, it all sounds nice on an organ. Well, the corno dolce has a special role in this organ. I understand you like to trick people into seeing if they can figure that out. The harmonic flute in this instrument does not have bass pipes because there just isn't room. So we borrowed the corno dolce bass to fill out the rest of the compass of the harmonic flute. Why don't you play the break point between the two, and let's see if I can remember where it was. Well, it was somewhere in there.
Somewhere.
But I think
I wouldn't want to say where.
when it works that well, I think the borrowing of another stop to complete one is not a bad idea. It certainly adds to the flexibility of the organ.
Absolutely.
Well, now we move on to string tone. Now, the string in the organ is very much like the family of strings in an orchestra. We have stops that sound quite a bit like violins, cellos, and violas and basses. So in this organ, we have a pair of strings, a gamba, and its celeste, again tuned a little sharp, so it gives that feeling of a big string section. And I would like to hear that played in such a way that you can, almost like a string quartet.
Right.
First, the gamba. Now that string-like sound is made by open pipes of very small scale, or rather very small diameter, just the opposite of flute pipes. They're at the other extreme in size and shape of pipes. It's a very, very attractive effect, but especially so when you add the celeste. Could you demonstrate the richness and sweetness of the celeste tone added to that? Here comes the big violin section. Beautiful. Now let's add cellos and basses. and have the biggest symphonic string effect that this organ can produce. I guess anybody listening has figured out that this entire organ is under expression.
It is indeed. Yeah.
Well, that gives us some wonderful flexibility because the stops we've been listening to, the corno dolce and its celeste, are in one swell box, and the gambas are in another. Correct. And so with that flexibility, you can make a wonderful transition from one tone quality to another and build the dynamic. Could you demonstrate that for us?
Certainly, and this is just 4 stops. So I'm going to start on the great, and then I'll add the great 4-foot supercouplet to that, and then include that with the gamba and gamba celeste, using the double expression all the way.
Now we'll see why it's so important to look thoroughly at string tone and flute tone before talking about diapason tone, the tone that some people call principal tone. It's called that because it's the most important tone of the organ. It's unique to the organ. There's nothing like it in the world of music, and it's what everybody expects to be the foundational heart of an organ. But it's a very tricky thing to achieve good diapason tone because it's really a synthetic tone. It's a tone halfway between string and flute tone. And unless it's exactly halfway, it will either sound too stringy or too fluty. And it's very tricky to achieve because it has to be set for each individual building and the acoustic of that building. So it's also a reason, by the way, why diapason tone gives a national flavor to organs. French diapasons sound different from English diapasons, from American, and so on and so forth. Also, each builder has a diapason style. And that's why, because it's such a variable kind of tone. So I would like to demonstrate that with your help. If you would play for me a combination of the string tone and flute tone together, and then we'll contrast it with a true diapason tone, our first one we've heard today. So first, here's a combination of gamba and stop diapason, flute and string. The same chord on a true diapason. And back to the synthesis of the two. So you can see how very closely related those two tones are. And it's very helpful to know that because in many cases you can, as we'll show a little later, you can combine the flute and string tones and flute and other tones sometimes in order to achieve a special or secondary diapason effect. Now let's concentrate on the diapason tones of the organ. First of all, let's hear again a little more elaborate demonstration of the diapason by itself. Now this is a good point to show the importance of 8-foot tone in any organ. Keep in mind that the music, except for the pedal line, is all written at 8 foot. So the 8-foot line in an organ is the piano pitch, it's the natural pitch, it's the most important pitch of the organ. And an interesting way to demonstrate that is to show how much music you can get out of just 8-foot pipes. So, Nigel, would you play all
Certainly,
eight
all 8.
8-foot stops together and show the grandeur of that sound with nothing but 8-foot tones?
Certainly, it's a very lush one.
I mentioned that the diapason is the most important tone of the organ, and that's because upon it you can build a chorus of diapason tone, which is just a fantastic effect in any pipe organ. It's really the heart of the instrument. And it involves having diapason tones at each of the pitch levels in the harmonic train above the 8-foot level. So let's show each one independently first. First, of course, the 8-foot diapason. Now the same passage on the 4-foot principal, which is a slightly smaller scaled diapason, very brightly toned. Now on this instrument, the pitches above 4 foot are combined together in a mixture stop. The mixture can be demonstrated best by playing a scale passage. That's including 3 pitches above the 4-foot line. Now, we'll put them all together and add the 16-foot component, which in this case is the corno dolce bass. So we'll play a hymn introducing the 8-foot first, 4-foot mixture, and then 16-foot stop.
Right, and what we can also do on this instrument is use the supercoupler, the great 4, as a 2-foot. So we have 8-foot, 4-foot, the supercoupler, which gives us a 2-foot, and then the mixture, because the coupler doesn't supercouple the mixture.
Excellent idea. This organ has a secondary kind of diapason tone called the solitional. It's a small scale diapason with a light tone, but still in the diapason family. It makes a wonderful basis for the swell organ. Could you demonstrate that for us?
Certainly.
Now, for a bit more body to that tone, we can add the stop diapason. Since the solitional has a bit more string quality than the pure diapason tone, it works beautifully with a flute, just as the true strings do.
It does, and we can also add the gamba stop and contrast the different colors within the swell, because we have the gamba in the inner box, the solitional and stop diapason in the outer box. So let me illustrate how we can give different colors, bring out the different colors of these stops in one passage.
Nigel, you've shown us several types of diapason tone, some shaded by flutes and strings and chorus material. How do you make use of that musically? Could you give us a couple examples?
Certainly. Well, Bach, of course, we can have the great chorus, 16, 8, 4 in mixture, and contrast that with the solitional chorus and the swell, 8, 4, and 2.
other
And then
usages for this?
versatility of a third manual, we can set up the French classical chorus as such as here.
Well, this is a two-manual organ with the luxury of a third manual. Is it really valuable?
Absolutely, I use it all the time. Here in French Romantic music, we can set up our 3 different contrasting manuals as the composers specify.
I imagine that the third manual would be pretty helpful in playing transcriptions.
Critical, really. Here's the beginning of the Tristan Prelude, Wagner's Tristan Prelude, and we have manual for the flugelhorn, the strings, and the clarinet all at the same time because they're all being used at the same time.
Well, Nigel, some of your examples have tantalized us with a bit of reed tone. We've so far been talking only about flus. Now we can look at the reeds in a little more detail. I should explain for anybody who doesn't understand, there are 2 types of organ pipes, the flu, which is really a whistle, and the reed, which makes its tone much like a clarinet with a vibrating reed, tone amplified by a resonator to make sounds like the woodwinds and brass of the orchestra. So let's start with one of the most beautiful and lyrical members of the sort of woodwind family of the organ, the clarinet. Well, we have the luxury of having a second color reed in this organ, a flugelhorn, much like its orchestral counterpart. It has a nice, dark, mellow tone. It can imitate French horns. It can imitate a soft, muted trumpet. It can do all sorts of things, and here it is in some of its various roles.
Mm-hmm. Here's a call.
And how about a lyrical passage? Well, this organ only has one chorus reed, but it's quite a chorus reed. Under 10-inch wind pressure, with a 16-foot extension, it's the tuba stop. And it has many moods, which you can illustrate now, starting with something quite lyrical, a bit of a surprising sound for a tuba. Well, now, this is hard to believe, but a tuba can also be rather sprightly. In fact, it might even be able to play a minuet. And of course, now, the tuba's most important and famous role in a fanfare. Well, Nigel, I think I can tell from your accent that you know all about the English full swell effect that is so wonderfully used by all British organists in hymn playing, where the full grate is playing and then suddenly this roaring swell comes in and really elevates the people singing tremendously. Could you demonstrate that?
Absolutely.
Nigel, you've done a wonderful job showing the individual tones of the organ. Now it's time for a finale, showing them all, and also the special effect this organ has that's a little unusual. You've shown it, but we haven't discussed it. That's double expression. Mm-hmm. In this organ, we have the high-pressure strings, that's gamba and celeste, and the high-pressure tuba in their own swell box inside the main swell box, so that in effect we can achieve a far greater range of expression. One of the sad things in most organs is that we'd like to go from double or triple piano to double or triple forte, and it's very difficult to do. But this device allows that to happen and also allows us to make a lot of color contrasts and combinations. Mm-hmm. So in this last number, perhaps you could explain a little bit about what you're going to do and then give us a rousing conclusion.
Sure. Well, I'm going to play the last few phrases of Elgar's Nimrod, and it builds up to full organ with the tuba on its own, playing octaves, and with the double expression we can bring the tuba down and incorporate it into the chorus as a chorus reed and then reopen it, so you have full organ all in the chorus, and of course the famous decrescendo down to the whisper of the quieter stops on the organ.
Thank you for such a wonderful demonstration of this instrument.
You're very welcome, Jack.
So musicianly, very beautiful.
And I'm very honored to be playing a Schoenstein every week. That's a real pleasure.